We're going to be showing you how to use a spreadsheet, whether it's Excel, Google Sheets. They all work about the same way with their own quirks. You might have put Excel on your resume and you're now going to have to use it in your new job and getting a bit nervous. This video is for you. So to start off, we're going to be using Google Sheets. So go ahead and set up your Google account and log in and look for Google Sheets in Google and click on Google Sheets. You click on sign in and you'll be able to create a new blank spreadsheet. Once you're there, you're going to name it something like my spreadsheet or whatever, and we're going to start working. Now that your spreadsheet is set up, you'll be able to access it anytime you go to the Google Sheets homepage. Other systems have different ways of setting up and saving spreadsheets, but that's more basic computer stuff, and we're going to be focusing here on spreadsheets. So to start off, the anatomy of a spreadsheet, let's get rid of all these nag windows and have a nice clear view of our spreadsheet. Now, a spreadsheet comes with columns and rows. The columns are named A, B, C, D, etc., and the rows are named 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And the spreadsheet in its entirety, it's called either a spreadsheet or a workbook sometimes in Excel, and can have several different sheets here. So you'll see the sheets at the very bottom. So here's sheet 1, and you can use the plus symbol to add any number of sheets, and they can all contain different data. So for example, in sheet 1, I can go to a cell and type in hello, and in sheet 2, I can type in something else, etc. So all these sheets are different. I'm going to get rid of my extra sheets for now to focus on sheet 1. Now, cells are always referenced by their column, and column C, row 3, would be cell C3. If you have column G and row 9, you'd have cell G9. The other thing common to all spreadsheet programs is the formula bar, which is up here. And the formula bar always shows you the contents of the selected cell. So I'm selecting cell G9 here, my formula bar is empty. If you select cell B3, the formula bar will contain the word hello. So formula bar, columns, rows, sheets, and the entire spreadsheet or workbook. Ranges. Now we're going to reference cells with the column and row like B3. You can reference ranges. For example, if you have a range of several cells, let's take the cells B3 until C4, you would use the notation B3 to C4, so B3 colon C4. So now that the basics are out of the way, let's start by filling in some data in our spreadsheet. Let's imagine we have a spreadsheet where we want to track employees along with their information such as their seniority and so on. So I'll imagine a structure for my spreadsheet where my column A will be my employee's name, my column B will be their seniority. So I'm going to use the zoom function to make this a bit bigger so you all see what's going on. Column A will be the employee number, or the employee name rather, and their seniority. Now let's imagine we have 4 employees, Tom, Mohammed, Sylvia, and Denise, and their seniority will go something like this. Now is the time to look at the difference between data and formulas. So data is actually typing in something into a cell. So cell B2, for example, has data 10 in it. Cell A5 has Denise. And you can see this by looking at the formula bar here contains the same information as the actual cell. Now let's imagine, for example, that we know that Denise came in at the same time as Tom. And for whatever reason, we want to not put the actual number 4 here, but we want to put the same number as is in the cell B2. So to do that, you would just type in equals B2. And now cell B5 contains 10, but if you click on it, in the formula bar, you're going to see B equals B2 and not the number 10. If I change Tom's 10-year seniority and I put in 9 instead, Denise's seniority is going to change to 9 as well, because the number 9 is actually appearing in cell B2, and the formula equals B2 appears in cell B5. Let's take a look now at functions. Let's take another example. Let's say we want to have the sum of these 4 employees' seniorities. We can create a formula equals B2 plus B3 plus B4 plus B5. That's not the right way to do it. I'll tell you why in a second. So this gives me 50. It's the right answer. But let's say, for example, we add an employee here. If I control click on the number 3 and insert one row below 3, and I add an employee named Jake, and Jake's seniority is 1 year, we'll see that 50 does not become 51, because if we double click on the cell 50, we're going to see that B2 is yellow, and the B2 cell here is yellow, B3 is purple, B3 cell is purple, B5 is blue, and B6 is red, and it doesn't take into account Jake's seniority. So obviously we could just add plus B4, but that's error prone and tedious. So we're going to get rid of this formula entirely and use a function. Now functions perform some sort of manipulation on the data. So functions have names, in this case sum, and they have arguments, in this case a range. We looked at ranges earlier, so B2 to B6 is a range. Now this is not the way to do it either, and I'll show you why in a second. This gives us 51, and in this case, if we add a new employee here, let's say Danielle, and Danielle's seniority is 3, we'll notice that the formula expands to go from cell B2 to B7, no matter how many intermediate cells we add there. We can also remove a cell. Let's say Jake was added by mistake and we want to delete him. Everything works as planned. Now, the problem with this is that if we decide to add a new person at the bottom of the list, let's say I go to row 6 and I control click, insert one row below, and I say that a new employee came in, say David, and David has 1 year seniority when he's added to the spreadsheet. We'll see that 53 does not update. Why? Because the range B2 to B6 is not updated to include items that appear below B6. So now we're going to look at the concept of the blank line above and below ranges. Instead of a function equals sum B2 to B6, in this case, we're going to include the blank line before our row containing our formula. So in this case, it would be B8. This means that if I add a line below David now, and let's say call it Suresh, and Suresh has 3 years, now it's going to be added because the blank line here was included. This is still not the right way of doing it, because someone may come in and add a new employee before Tom here. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go up here, insert one row above, and this employee's name will be Ming. And Ming's seniority will be 10. Now, we'll notice that the number 57 at cell B7 will not be updated. We added a row above our range and not within our range. So let's fix that again, and we're going to have our sum from B2 to B10, and now everything's going to work. But if someone adds another employee above Ming, then we still might run into the same problem. So what I like to do is always have a blank line above the first entry and a blank line below, and I like my function to include those blank lines. So in this case, I want it to be sum B2 to B11. Now we're going to take a look at exporting our data. So you might want to use the export function or download function in Google Sheets to download to Microsoft Excel. You can download it as a PDF, as a CSV. So the main ones I use are Excel. In order to share documents with other people, they normally expect Excel formatted spreadsheets and comma separated values, CSV. So once in a while, someone's going to ask you for a CSV, especially if you're importing information into some sort of another system, then they're going to ask you for CSVs. CSV is a format in order to export a sheet of a spreadsheet. Let's take a look now at clicking versus double clicking. When you click on a cell, for example, cell B12, you're selecting the cell, and if you start typing something in, let's say the number 7, it's going to replace everything. I'm going to undo that with Control Z, and I'm going to now double click. When you double click, you can actually start editing whatever information is within that cell. Next up, navigating between cells. So you can use your cursor to do that, obviously, but I would recommend using the arrow keys, the tab keys, shift tab to navigate. The arrow keys can also be used to navigate your spreadsheet when creating a formula. So let's say, for example, I want to know the total seniority of all people who have a seniority above 10 years. I might have something like this, so equal, and I can now click on B3 plus B5 plus B7, and that's 42 years. And you can also use your arrow keys to navigate the spreadsheet. So equals, and then you would click on arrow left to go to B3. You'd write plus, and then you would use the arrow keys to navigate to B5, plus, and so on. So you can avoid using your mouse in most cases and navigate using your arrow keys or tab or shift tab. This is not the right way of doing it, though, because our formula is prone to errors. Let's say if someone else gets added with more than 10 years seniority, or if a mistake is corrected, and let's say Tom had 10 and not 9 years, Tom will not be added to the total of all employees with more than 10 years seniority. So let's now introduce the concept of SUMIF. So I'm going to get rid of my number 42 here, and I'm going to do it a different way. I'm going to add a new column, and I'll call my column over 10 years seniority. And I'm going to, in C3, create a formula equals B3 more than or equal, so more than or equal to 10. This formula here says that if B3 is more than or equal to 10, we'll get the word true show up. In case otherwise we're going to get the word false. And we're going to do the same thing with Tom. If, or B4 more than or equal 10. You'll notice it's a bit tedious because we're going to have to repeat our formula for every one of our employees. So we can always copy and paste the formula. To do that, we'll just select a cell, Command or Control C to copy it, and paste it wherever we want to paste it. If you look at cell 4, which I copied, the formula is equals B4 more than or equal than 10. If you look at cell C5, the B4 has been converted to B5. So spreadsheets are going to always consider that cells are relative to the cell where the formula is. So reference cells are relative to where the formula is. If I copy my formula now, what I can do is I can select my entire range by clicking Shift down key and now Control V. You'll notice that the formula has always been copy pasted, referencing the cell to the left of it. Now let's say I want to have the sum of every employee's seniority if they're over 10 years. I can do something like, I'm going to just add total here to 67 because this is the total of all of my employees' seniority. And I'll write here total if more than 10 years. Let's introduce the concept of arguments to functions. Functions have a name, for example, sum, and then open parentheses, and any number of arguments. Now, the argument to sum is a range. There's one argument, and it's a range. So in this case, the range B2 to B11. SUMIF takes a few more arguments. It takes 3 arguments, and arguments are separated by commas. So let's go SUMIF. Let's get rid of this first argument, which is a range. So the first argument to SUMIF is a range as well, but it's a range of conditions. So we're going to select C2 to C11. That's our first argument to our SUMIF function. So it's going to look at that range to determine if that range contains values which are considered appropriate to sum up the range of numbers we want to sum. So SUMIF C2 to C11. So it's going to select all of the rows which contain true in this case. That's our second argument to SUMIF. And our third argument is what we're going to sum up, B2 to B11. So this is about as intimidating as spreadsheets get. Look at that formula, and let's try to unpack it once more. SUMIF is the name of the function, and there are 3 arguments. First argument is a range. Second argument is the value that must be true within each row in that range for us to include the items of the third argument, B2 to B11, within our total. I'm going to see what that gives us. And it does give us 42. If you don't know SUMIF, and many users of Excel do not, they're going to do something like we did earlier, B3 plus B5 plus B7, and that is very error prone. Next up, we're going to look at printing. So let's say, for example, I want to print this spreadsheet, but I only want to print range A1 to B13 because this over 10 years seniority, true or false, is not really that interesting to someone who gets a PDF or a printout of this spreadsheet. So if you use file print, it's going to include all of this extra information that you don't want. I'm going to cancel this, and I'm going to select only what I want. I'm going to use file print again. And instead of printing the current sheet, I'm going to print the selected cells, and I can do everything else I normally do with printing, page orientation, and so on. And next is going to basically create a PDF that I can then print from my PDF program. Let's now imagine that we want to have not only the total number of seniority if we have 10 years seniority, but also 5 years seniority. So I'm going to add a new column here called over 5 years seniority. And I'm going to copy this cell, and I'm going to paste it here. And I'm going to modify it slightly. So instead of if C3 equals more than 10, more equal than 10, I'll put B3 equals more equal than 10, because don't forget, when you copy paste a formula from one cell to another, spreadsheets will consider that the reference cells are relative. So in this particular formula, we're looking at B3, which is a cell to the right of C3. If I copy paste this to D3 and I double click, it's going to consider that this cell, that this referenced cell is now the one cell to the left, so C3, which is obviously not true in this case. So we'll just change it for now, and I'll show you how to avoid that in the future. So we'll put B3 instead of C3. And we're going to copy paste everywhere. And instead of 10, we're going to put 5. And we're going to copy paste it everywhere. And here we'll have total if more than 5 years seniority. And we're going to do the same thing. SUMIF D3, D2 to D11, true, B2 to B11, and now the sum total of all employees' seniority if they have more than 5 years is 60. Now your management might say, well, in addition to 10 and 5, I'd also like to have over 3 years seniority. And now it's getting tedious because we have to redo the same thing over and over. So let's refactor. Refactoring means changing our spreadsheet formulas to give us the same output, but to make it simpler to use. Let's start by adding a column. Let's start by adding a row below our header here and say 10 and 5, and here we'll have over this many years seniority, 10, 5, and 3, right? And what we would like to do is we would like to have a formula that we can just copy and paste from C4 all the way to E11 and for it to always be right. So let's take a look at our formula. Let's get rid of all of these cells here and let's rework our formula in C4. So we know that B4 over and above 10 is the formula correct. So we can see that our formula is if B4 is more than or equal to 10. So in this case, we can replace 10 with C2, right? So if we change C2 to, let's say, 40, this changes, which is good. However, if I copy and paste this here, we're going to notice that the first part of our formula, we would like it to remain at B4, but it moved to C4, because that's what spreadsheets do. So let's go back to the drawing board with this formula and understand the concept of the $ before a row or column number. So in this case, we want the column to always remain the same in the first part of our formula. So we want the B to always remain the same. We're going to put a $ before it, right? So the $ here, what it tells us is that we don't want B to always be relative to our current cell. We want it to be absolute. So we're going to copy paste that to D and to E. And we'll notice that if we double click on D, well, B4 stays the same because we put the $. Same thing with E. B4 and not D4 is in our formula. So let's go ahead and copy paste all of these across the board. And now we have some problems because we know that Mohammed has 14 years and it still says false. Why is that? Well, if we go back to C4, we'll notice that the second part of our formula, C2, is actually 2 cells above our current cell. So when we copy and paste that to Mohammed, well, the second part of the formula remains 2 cells above our current cell. So let's go back to the drawing board with that formula. And we know that the column 2 should remain absolute, but not... So we know that the row 2 should remain absolute in this case, so 2, not the column number. So in this case, the formula is correct. $B4 $B means we want to have the absolute column B, but always the row, which is relative, more than or equal to relative column, but absolute row 2. Let's copy paste this everywhere. Suresh now is not over 10 years, not over 5 years, but is over 3 years. And if we double click on this formula here, we'll see that the $B remained the same here as it was here. So we're always looking at column B regardless of where we're pasting. The row number changes though. 4 becomes 5, becomes 6, and etc. Same thing with the column. If we look at Suresh's column here, column E, $2, the dollar before 2 means that the column is always going to remain the same. So here we have E2, here we'll have D2, here we'll have C2, but the 2 remains the same. Now this is always, this is going to be always correct. And this does allow us eventually, if our management asks us to add more, let's say 15 years here, and we can just copy paste our formula, and we'll notice that only Sylvia has more than 15 years and all the others are false. So that's how copy pasting formulas work, absolute and absolute and relative cell references as well. Now let's make our SUMIF functions, let's make them reusable. We're going to start by adding a sum to each column representing the number of years of seniority. So in this case, in C13, I'll add a SUMIF. We've seen that before. SUMIF C3 to C12, true. And we want the sum to be B3 to B12. And that works fine. However, it will not work for the others because we didn't tell our system which columns and rows need to be absolute. So in this case, C13 to C12 should be relative, but the B column should be absolute, right? The B column should always be the column that we're calculating and not the column relative to the current cell. Now let's use our arrow keys and Command V, and now we do have a correct number of total seniority for the number of years. Now let's imagine that we want to add these here, below the total. So let's say grand total, total if more than 10 years, total if more than 5 years, total if more than 3 years, and total if more than 15 years. So we could basically here just equal C13, here we'd have equal D13, here we'll have equal E13, and here we'll have equal F13. That's not the right way to do it. Because, well, first of all, let's look at some formatting. We'll look at formatting all through this video, but let's look at some formatting here. I'm going to select these and I'm going to format these as wrapped. So we'll be able to see what's going on. The text is not going to overflow. The problem here is that, let's say if I change the 15 here to 20 in F2, F13 is going to update to 0 as expected because no one has more than 20 years experience. However, here it still says total if more than 15 years. That brings us to an all-important point whenever you're working with spreadsheets or basically anything computer related. It's the DRY, the dry principle, don't repeat yourself. So here we repeated the concept of 15 years twice. The term 15 appears down here in cell A7, and it also appeared up here in cell F2. Inevitably, you or someone else is going to change that number at some point in one place and forget to change it elsewhere, and it's going to create a disconnect. Now let's move this back to 15 and see how we can do this the right way. So now we want to have the numbers 42, 60, 66, and 18 on a row axis. We want to have those on a column axis. So let's get rid of these, and let's use the transpose function. Transpose basically takes something from an X column and transposes it to a Y column, or the opposite. So we'll transpose these four, 42 to 18, in B14. And what that's going to do is it's going to take up these numbers, and it's going to just move them all into a vertical format. We can do the same thing with the number of years here, so we can transpose 10 to 15 from here and move them over from here to here. Why does it say reference? Hash ref means there's a problem. And if you hover over it, it says array result was not expanded because it would overwrite data in A15. Well, obviously, if we want to transpose C2 to F15, it's going to want to put in a bunch of data here, but it already says total if more than 5 years here. So if I delete that, and I delete A16 also, and I delete A17 as well, then our formula from A14 transpose C2 to F2 has the room to expand. Now, instead of it saying 10, 15, 3, 15, 42, 60, 66, and 18, that's not really understandable. If we print that out, no one's going to know what we're talking about. We want this to say total seniority of people with more than 10 years. I'm going to move this information because I still need it, right? But I don't want it to appear this way. I want it to say something like total seniority if more than 10 years. I don't want it to say the number 10, but I still need the number 10 to exist. So I can move this from A14, A17 to G14, G17. How do I move this from A14, A17 to G14, G17? I'll introduce the concept of copy pasting versus cut and paste. Let's go to another sheet here that I like to call sandbox. So my sandbox sheet is a sheet that I have in all my spreadsheets that I use just to test stuff out, to understand concepts before I actually implement them in my main sheet. So let's say that we have a number 5 and a number 6. And we have a total, let's say a sum of B3 to C3. That would give us 11. Now let's say I want to move this elsewhere. I want to move D3 and I want to move it to B5, let's say, for example. So I could basically take it, copy, paste it. It's not really going to work because it's going to say, well, you're asking me to sum up the two cells, like one cell to the left and then a cell 2 cells to the left. And I can't do this here. Reference doesn't exist because 2 cells to the left would go to the left of column A, and that doesn't exist because we started column A. So what we could do is use the dollar signs as we did previously. So B3, in fact, the column has to be absolute as well. So B3 to C3 absolute. Now I can copy paste it, and now I can delete this column here. And the sum will remain the same. There's a problem with that. Let's go back to where we were. I'm going to undo, 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 and go back to where we were. Now let's say, for example, this number 11 here was used by some other calculation, and I could call it 11 times 2, for example. So 5 and 6 are hard-coded. They're actually real numbers. Here we have a formula which is the sum of B3 and C3, so 11, and here we have the total of, or the value of cell D3 times 2. Let's say I want to move this cell from D3 to D5, so I can, or D3 to B5. So I'm going to copy it and paste it now that it's absolute. It does work. Now we have 2 cells doing the same thing. If I change 6 to, let's say, 60, everything's going to work correctly. And now I wanted to move this D3 to D5 so I can erase D3. The problem is that our function E3 still referencing D3, right? So let's undo, and move this cell correctly, right? What we want is to move the cell, and for every cell referencing this cell, to keep referencing the new cell. That's where the cut functions come in. So that's where the cut function comes in. So I'm going to Command X or Control X on Windows and Command V on B5. And now we'll notice that E3, which used to reference D3, now references B5, because that's how cut and paste works. It cuts and pastes the cell itself, but also all references to it. That it works also if you don't use absolute references. So here you'll see that my function 22 is B5 times 2. Now let's say I want to move D3 to C5. I don't actually need to make B5 absolute. I can just cut the cell and paste it. It's still going to work. So cut and paste basically is the perfect way to move cells around. So copying is if you want to copy something and have two versions of it. Cut is if you want to move. So let's cut this A14 to A17, and let's paste it in G14 to G17. Everything still works, but now this contains no information. So let's type in what we mean here. So total of seniority if more than X years. And I copied those 4 times. Let's go back and wrap the information within those cells. We don't want the word X to appear. We want the number 10 to appear here. So the way to do that is to create a formula. So instead of total seniority if more than X years, I'll say equal. I'll open my quotes. I'm going to end my quotes after years. What we're going to do now is we're going to combine the string with G14. So we'll put and G14. Total number of seniority if more than X years, 10, 5, 3, and 15. So I just copy pasted that formula everywhere. Now I want to have 10 instead of X. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that. I'm going to use if more than and G14 and years. That looks nice. This does take up a lot of room, so I'm going to move this column a little bit by dragging between A and B so that we have a nicer layout, right? I can even make it on one line. I'm going to put this a bit smaller. Now what's interesting is that if we want to have, let's say, 10 for 315, everything's going to update correctly. If we want to have 10 for 320, we can just change 20 here, and everything updates correctly. All the totals update correctly. Still some room for improvement, because if we add a column here and we'll say we also want to track people who have more than, let's say, 18 years seniority. We just copy pasted this here. It does work, but this doesn't update. Why not? So the same way we had an empty line before and after our sum function, we want to have an empty column before and after our transpose function. So we're going to add an empty column here. And in our transpose function, instead of transposing D2 to G2, we're going to transpose C2, leaving the empty line, to I2, right? And same thing here, we're going to transpose C13 to I13. Now all of this works, however, this is still not right. So what we can do here is, let's get rid of this one. We can copy paste 3, 20, 18. The problem there is that if we delete a column here, it still says total of seniority of more than X years. So what we can do here is say, use our if function. So instead of always writing total of seniority of more than whatever years, we'll say if H19 is not, so less than, more than, that's the is not notation, is not an empty string, comma, so that's the condition. If H19 is not empty, then we'll type total of seniority no more than X years. If not, we'll just output an empty string, right? And I can take this function and I can copy paste it everywhere. Now, whenever I add a number of years here, let's say no, here would be 0, I would just copy paste all of this stuff. It kind of always works. It's not going to be dependent on the number of data points we have here. So I can also delete a number of items here. I'm going to delete these 3 columns, and this always updates. What I like to do is, and this is a question of style, but I like to, anything that is what I like to call intermediate calculations, so calculations that are not meant to be shown to on printed out versions of this data, I'll put a different color. I like to put mine light blue. So anything that's light blue is not meant to be printed. So when I print this out, I'm going to only select this. As before, print. I'll print my selected cells only, and it's going to print a nice output. And I can change these information whenever I want. Let's imagine that in addition to our total, we want to also have our average. So we notice here that the grand total is 67. We can do the same thing with our average. So we're going to have average of B3 to B4 to B12 and average seniority, right? And we also want to have the same thing with average seniority if more than. So I'm going to copy these 4 lines here, and instead of saying total seniority, I'll say average seniority. And I'm going to copy paste that all the way here. Obviously there's nothing yet because we don't have any, we're not calculating our average seniority. We will in a second. So what is our average seniority? The equivalent of SUMIF would be average if. So in this case we have SUMIF. I put SUMIF here in lowercase. Normally it's a good practice to put it uppercase, but both will work. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the same function, but average if. So average if, first argument, true, second argument, right? And in this case, our B column needs to be absolute, so $. So the average seniority of people who have more than 10 years is 14. The average seniority of people who have more than 18 years is 18. I'm going to transpose this in column F because that's where we transposed our. So remember how we transposed our total from F14 to F17, and we're consuming that information in F14, in A14 rather to A17. We're going to do the same thing in A19 to A22 and transpose our information for averages. We'll notice that it appears right away, and we now have to only transpose from B19 to B22 the actual number of So do you remember how we transposed our number of years here, C2 to F2. In F14 to F17, which is then consumed by this information here. We're going to do the same thing in F19 to F22. We're going to transpose our number of years we're going to transpose our number of years, which will then appear here, and all we need to do now is get the actual information. So we're going to transpose C14 to F14, and now we have a nice little spreadsheet where we can change the number of years here, let's say from 10 to 5, and all the information is going to update correctly. I can change this from 18 to 10. I can add a year. I can add some years here. Let's say 8. I'll copy paste all of this. Now everything works. And if you have a ref here, array result was not expanded, we'll just add some lines and everything should work fine. The reason why we got that ref, let me undo this and let's inspect that for a second. We saw earlier that when you transpose something from one place to another, or if you use any function that fills in more columns or rows than the current row or the Now I'm going to undo what I just did, because this is something that can happen often. These array results were not expanded. And we're going to go back to our sandbox and check that out. So what is array functions not expanded error? Let's take a look at that a little bit more closely. So again, let's say we have A, B, C, D here, or whatever, and we'll use the transpose function to transpose them. Not transpose, but transpose A, B, C, and D. Everything works fine. The problem occurs if there is something here which is blocking these from expanding. So if let's say I add a new column between C and D, I'm going to right away get a ref error at B5. Why is that? Because we're transposing B3 to, which used to be E3, and I added a new column between D and F, the current F, which is the new column E. So my function expands, right? But because there is something here, it's telling me, well, I can't expand it anymore because there's no room. You have to add a row, which I'm doing now. Every time I add a new column here, I'm going to get that ref problem. Okay? This can also happen using the filter function. Let's imagine, I'm going to delete this. Let's imagine I have a set of data. So apples, 3, oranges, 8. I'll have sweet potatoes, 2, and apples are fruits, and sweet potatoes are vegetables, right? Now, there is something called a filter function. So filter is basically takes an entire range, for example, C3 to E5, and as a second argument takes a range from which to filter it, so fruits and vegetables, fruits or vegetables with type of item, equals fruits. So take a look at that function. Filter. First function, a range, C3 colon E5. Second function, a column, E3 to E5 equals fruits. Now this is only going to filter by the type fruits. and there could be some other data here. Now again, the problem is going to occur if we add a row. If, let's say, we add a row of vegetables, and let's say yams 25, and yams are vegetables, it's not going to change this because we're only getting fruits. But if we add kiwis here, and we have like 2 kiwis, and these are fruits, we're right away, as soon as I press enter, going to get a ref error at C9. Why? Because we can't expand, and the error is going to be array result was not expanded. Because it's trying to add apples, oranges, and kiwis before this some other data here. So all I have to do is add rows or columns when that happens. So the last thing I want to take a look at with you guys before I leave is validation. Validation just means that, like, there's no obvious errors in your spreadsheet. You want to, because spreadsheets get very, very complex very fast, and you want to be able to spot errors quickly. Let's imagine an accounting system where we have a chart of accounts and an actual journal. So typical accounting stuff, you might have a bank account, you might have internet expenses, you might have client revenue, right? And these are all accounts that you have, and then in your journal you might have, for example, in your bank account, you might have $100 leaving your bank account and $100 going to your internet, and then you might have $4,000 coming into your bank account. So let's say client revenue, you have $4,000 coming in from revenue, and all these things need to balance. Now what I like to do is, and there's several ways of doing this, but the idea is that you want to catch errors, like for example, if you let's say have $100 going into your internet, but you're only taking out 90 from your bank account. You want to have a way to catch that real quickly. So what I use is a validation system. The first or second or third line of every sheet, I'm going to keep it reserved for my validation. In this case, the sum of my column B to be 0. So if I take sum B2 to the end of my column B, should be 0, and I like to make it red by default, meaning there's an error, and add some conditional formatting and make it custom formula equals B1 equals 0. If it's 0, we're all good, so we're going to make that green. So the same thing with, you can do that for every sheet. So in my chart of accounts, for example, my bank account, I'll add a blank line there, so I'm going to take SUMIF. So we want to take the sum of all my journal entries from A2 to the end of column A, my chart bank account A3, and we want to get all of our results in column B2 to B. So we've had a movement of 3,900 in our bank account, which corresponds to minus 100 plus 400. And we obviously want to make these absolute in most cases, except line 3 we're dealing with. And my internet's 100, my client's revenue is minus 4,000. And same thing here, we're going to use the sum of our column, which should be 0, and we can copy paste not the entire formula, although in this case we could. We want to paste only the conditional formatting or the formatting. I encourage you to use keyboard shortcuts. In this case on a Mac it's Command Option V, so I'm going to use that, Command Option V, which only pastes all the format. I like to have a sheet called validation in all of my spreadsheets where I refer to chart, journal, perhaps some of my other sheets here, and for each of them I'm going to link to the validation cell. And again here I'm going to copy paste the conditional formatting. Command Option V. if anything goes wrong anywhere in your spreadsheet, if anything looks not right, you can always come back to the validation sheet and make sure everything is green. So for example, if someone, for some reason, misspells internet here and calls it internee. Now see, we have a problem in our validation. Our chart is wrong because it doesn't equal 0. I like to have a global validation where here I'm going to put, I'll call it global validation equals sum B2 to the end of column B. Again, I'm going to copy paste my conditional formatting, and then in chart here I'm going to reference my global validation with the conditional formatting, copy paste this in my journal as well, and now I'll see that if I misspell internet, I right away have a validation issue, and I can see that on all of my sheets which reference the validation. So I can right away know that where the problem is happening. It's happening in chart. I can see that chart doesn't equal 0, internet 0, that's weird. Then I can find the problem and fix it. I hope this has been a good introductory course to spreadsheets, and it's going to make you have a good first day at work.